The autumn wind swept across the Arizona desert, like the breath of some ancient, restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a harsh winter to come. Shadows stretched long across the Turner homestead as dusk settled over the cottonwoods by Lightning Creek, their bare branches reaching toward a sky painted in shades of copper and gold. The land here was unforgiving, beautiful in its starkness, but merciless to those who underestimated its power. Inside the small wooden house that Aaron Turner had built with his own hands 2 years prior, Nell Turner moved through her evening routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that staying busy was the only way to keep despair at bay. The crackle of lard in her cast-iron skillet provided the only sound, besides her 3-year-old daughter's soft humming. Emily sat in a chair far too large for her small frame, her legs swinging freely as she rocked a rag doll with one button eye, missing a casualty of too much love and not enough careful handling. The child possessed her father's striking hazel eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond her tender years. When she looked at Nell with those eyes, it was like seeing Aaron again, like having a piece of him still present in their small sanctuary against the wilderness. "Eat your beans, sweetheart," Nell reminded gently, though her own appetite had disappeared months ago, leaving her thinner than she'd ever been, her dresses hanging loose on her diminished frame. Emily looked up from her doll, those penetrating eyes focusing on her mother's face, with the intensity that sometimes made Nell's heart ache with remembrance. "Mama, when's Papa coming home?" The question came nearly every evening, as regular as sunset, and each time it struck Nell like a physical blow. She had stopped trying to explain the concept of missing to a 3-year-old mind that couldn't comprehend why someone who loved them would simply vanish without explanation. Instead, she forced her voice to remain steady, practiced in the art of hiding her own crumbling hope. "Not yet, darling, not yet." 3 months, 3 weeks, and 5 days had passed since Aaron Turner disappeared into the Superstition Mountains with his rifle slung over his shoulder and his leather game bag hanging empty at his side. He had kissed them both goodbye that morning, promising to return before dark, with fresh meat for their table. Nell could still feel the scratch of his beard against her cheek, still smell the familiar scent of soap and honest sweat that clung to his work shirts. 3 months since she had ridden their old mare into the settlement to report him missing her voice, steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. 3 months since neighbors had organized search parties combing the ridges and creek beds with the thoroughness of men who understood that the desert claimed its share of souls every year. 3 months of watching them return with nothing but sympathetic looks and uncomfortable silences that spoke louder than any words of condolence. The theories whispered in town varied like desert winds. Some spoke of mountain lions, those ghost-pale cats that could kill a man before he knew they were there. Others mentioned Apache war parties, though the tribes had been quiet for over a year. Still others suggested that Aaron had simply been claimed by the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them, perhaps fallen into one of the countless hidden ravines that scarred the mountain faces like old wounds. But Nell knew her husband better than any of them. Aaron Turner was cautious to the point of being overcautious, a man who checked his rifle twice before leaving the house, and who could track a wounded deer through country that would confuse a Paiute scout. He wasn't the kind of man to take foolish risks or lose his way in country he'd been hunting for 2 years. Something had taken him from her, something she couldn't bring herself to name aloud. Not with Emily's small ears always listening, always hoping for news of Papa's return. Now she faced the approaching winter alone. No family within 100 miles, her parents long dead and buried in the Kansas soil they'd never managed to escape. No close friends who could spare the time or resources to help a struggling widow. The homestead that Aaron had carved from the raw desert with nothing but determination and backbreaking labor was hers to manage. Now the house, with its roof that leaked in 3 places, the pen of squealing hogs that broke free whenever the wind blew hard enough, the struggling vegetable garden that fought a daily battle against alkalized soil and insufficient water. Every day brought the same exhausting cycle, hauling water from the creek in buckets that seemed to grow heavier with each trip, chopping firewood with an axe that felt unwieldy in her smaller hands, feeding animals that sensed her uncertainty and tested her authority at every turn. And through it all, Molly's needs had to be met, her questions answered, her childhood protected as much as possible from the harsh realities that pressed against their small sanctuary. Each dawn was a test of endurance that Nell wasn't certain she could continue to pass. But what choice did she have? Giving up meant losing everything Aaron had worked for, meant admitting that his sacrifice, for surely he had sacrificed his life somehow, in service to their dream, had been meaningless. A sudden crack from somewhere outside the house made her freeze her hand, gripping the ladle so tightly her knuckles showed white. Not the familiar groan of settling wood or the whisper of wind through the eaves, something deliberate, purposeful. The distinct sound of a boot striking dry timber. Nell's pulse hammered against her throat as she set down the ladle with exaggerated care and reached for the Winchester rifle that hung above the stone hearth. Aaron had taught her to shoot during their first winter, when the isolation and vulnerability of their position had become impossible to ignore. "A gun's no good to you if you can't use it when your hands are shaking," he had said, making her practice until she could hit a target even when her heart was racing with fear. Her hands trembled now as she checked the chamber, Aaron's voice echoing in her memory. "Always assume it's loaded, but always verify. A mistake with a firearm isn't something you get to make twice." Another sound reached her ears, footsteps circling the house with deliberate patience, like a predator studying its prey. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Bandits were known to prey on isolated homesteads, especially those protected only by women and children. Apache war parties, despite the relative peace of recent months, still posed a constant threat to settlers who ventured too far from the safety of towns. Desert ratsmen who had been driven mad by isolation and heat sometimes emerged from the wilderness, seeking supplies or worse. She had heard the stories whispered in the general store tales that made women pull their children closer and men check their weapons with grim purpose. Isolated homesteads found burned to the ground, families murdered or simply vanished without trace. Women who had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only questions and grief-stricken relatives who would never know their fate. "Emily!" she whispered, urgently proud, when her voice emerged steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Come here, baby, away from the window." The child's eyes widened at her mother's tone, but she possessed the instinctive obedience of a frontier child who had learned that certain voices meant immediate compliance without question. She slipped from her oversized chair and hurried to Nell's side, clutching her rag doll protectively against her small chest. They stood together in the flickering lamplight, mother and daughter united by fear and love, listening to the footsteps continue their measured circuit of their home. Nell found herself thinking of Aaron's Colt revolver, locked away in their bedroom trunk. Too far to reach now, and Emily was too young to be left alone, even for the few seconds it would take to retrieve it. Then came the knock. Not the violent pounding of someone intent on forcing entry, nor the tentative tap of a lost traveler. 3 soft, almost respectful raps against the side wall near the kitchen, a sound that somehow unnerved Nell more than aggressive demands would have. Bandits didn't knock politely. Neither did raiders bent on destruction. "Who's there?" she called out, surprised by the steady strength in her own voice. A man's voice answered from the darkness beyond her door, deep and measured, carrying the subtle accent she associated with the Apache people who still moved like shadows through the desert country. But his words were in perfect English, spoken with the careful precision of someone for whom it might be a second language. "Ma'am, I mean no harm to you or your child. I'm looking for work food if you can spare it. I can pay with labor. We have nothing here for strangers. Move along." The response came automatically, but even as she spoke, Nell found herself listening to the undertones of his voice. Not the aggressive desperation of a dangerous man, but something that spoke of bone-deep weariness and genuine need. "Please, ma'am. I can work hard, fix what needs fixing. I have strong hands, and I'm willing to earn whatever kindness you might spare." Emily tugged at her mother's worn skirt. "Mama, he sounds hungry." "Hush, sweetheart." But the child's innocent observation cut through Nell's fear like a blade. When had she become so hardened that a 3-year-old could recognize compassion where she saw only potential threat? Against every instinct screaming danger, against every story she'd heard about the terrible fates that befell women who trusted too easily. Nell found herself moving toward the door. She kept the rifle ready, her finger near the trigger, but she cracked the heavy wooden barrier just enough to peer through the gap. The man standing in her yard looked like something carved from the desert itself, by wind and time and hardship. Tall and broad-shouldered, despite an obvious thinness that spoke of too many missed meals, his skin bore the burnished bronze coloring of the Apache people. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, streaked with premature gray that suggested a life of unusual hardship. His clothes were dusty from long travel, but clean, and carefully mended. His boots, worn nearly through but still holding together through careful maintenance. Behind him stood a horse so thin its ribs showed clearly in the lamplight. Spilling from her door, a creature that had obviously traveled far on insufficient feed, yet still carried itself with the dignity of good breeding beneath its current distress. But it was the man's eyes that stopped Nell's breath in her throat. Dark as midnight and deep as mountain pools, they held a grief so profound and familiar that it seemed to echo the hollow ache that had been consuming her for months. This was not the face of a man bent on violence or theft, but of someone who had known loss as intimately as she had, who carried sorrows that had carved lines of premature age into his weathered features. "My name is Dean," he said, raising his hands, palms forward in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. The movement revealed old scars on his forearms, the kind of marks that came from honest work and perhaps less honest fights. "I ask only for a meal, ma'am. I can work for it, fix whatever needs fixing around your place. We don't need any work done." The lie came automatically, though her eyes unconsciously flicked toward the sagging gate of the hog pen that had been hanging crooked for weeks, the pile of uncut firewood that grew more daunting each day, the dozen other tasks that overwhelmed her from dawn to dusk. The man Dean followed her gaze and nodded slightly, as if cataloging the evident needs without judgment or presumption. "I understand your caution, ma'am. A woman alone with a child has every reason to be careful of strangers. But I give you my word of honor, I mean no harm to you or your little one. Just let me earn a meal with honest work, and I'll move on come morning, if that's your wish." Something in his voice, in the careful way he addressed her fears, without dismissing them, chipped at the walls she had built around her heart. He spoke to her as an equal, acknowledging her right to caution without patronizing her for it. How long had it been since a man had spoken to her with such respect? "You're Apache." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Does that trouble you?" The honest directness of his response surprised her. Most men would have deflected or denied understanding the fear that Apache heritage could inspire in isolated settlers. The fact that he answered truthfully suggested either dangerous confidence or genuine integrity. "My husband disappeared 3 months ago," she heard herself saying. "In those mountains." She nodded toward the dark peaks that loomed like sleeping giants against the star-scattered sky. Something flickered across Dean's weathered features, surprise recognition, and then something deeper that might have been pain or guilt. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." "He's not—" She caught herself before finishing the denial that had become automatic. "He's missing, not necessarily dead." Dean nodded slowly, but his eyes held the understanding of someone who recognized hope battling against terrible knowledge. There was something in his expression, a weight of certainty that made her stomach clench with dread. "All I ask is the chance to work for food," he repeated softly. "You can keep that rifle handy if it makes you feel safer. I won't blame you for caution." Perhaps it was the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying everything alone for so long. Perhaps it was the way Emily peeked around her skirts, without fear, studying the stranger, with the open curiosity of childhood rather than adult suspicion. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized in his dark eyes the same hollow ache that had been consuming her for months, and the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered, and was still trying to figure out how to continue breathing. "You can sleep in the barn." She heard herself saying the words emerging before her rational mind could stop them. "I'll bring you something to eat, but any trouble, any at all, and you'll answer to this rifle." "Understood, ma'am, and thank you. You won't regret this kindness." As Nell closed the door and leaned against it, her legs suddenly weak with delayed reaction. She wondered what Aaron would think of her inviting a stranger, an Apache stranger, onto their land. But Aaron wasn't here to offer his opinion, and she was tired of making every decision in isolation, tired of being afraid of her own shadow. She fed Emily quickly, mechanically, her mind spinning with the implications of what she had just done. Then she prepared a plate of beans and cornbread, adding a portion larger than she could truly spare, but somehow unable to send a starving man away with token charity. When she carried the food outside, she found Dean grooming his horse by the barn, using handfuls of straw to work the dust and sweat from the animal's coat. The careful attention he paid to his mount's welfare before seeing to his own needs spoke well of his character. A man who neglected his horse in frontier country was a man who didn't understand the basic requirements of survival. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, simply accepting the plate with a gratitude that seemed almost reverent. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite, not just for nourishment, but as an act of appreciation for the kindness shown. Nell found herself lingering, studying this stranger who had appeared at her door like something from a desert mirage. "Where do you come from? What brings you to this part of the territory?" Dean chewed thoughtfully before answering, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight she had brought with her. "Far from here, ma'am. Been traveling for some time now, looking for whatever comes next, I suppose." That sounds like the voice of a man running from something. His smile held no joy, only the tired acknowledgement of truth recognized. Running towards something, maybe? Or maybe just running. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. There was pain in his voice, layers of it, like sediment in a riverbed. Nell understood about pain that couldn't be easily explained, about losses too profound for casual conversation with strangers. "This is good land," Dean observed, changing the subject, with the skill of someone practiced in deflecting personal inquiries. "Your husband chose well when he claimed this section." Aaron had an eye for water and soil. Nell agreed, pride in her voice, despite her grief. "He said the creek would never run dry, and the ground would grow anything you were willing to work for." "Aaron." Dean repeated the name slowly, as if testing its weight on his tongue. "Aaron Turner, would that be—" Hope flared bright and desperate in Nell's chest, so sudden and intense it almost staggered her. "You knew him," but Dean was already shaking his head, his expression carefully neutral. "No, ma'am. It's a common name in these parts. I was thinking of someone else." The hope died as quickly as it had bloomed, leaving behind the familiar ache of disappointment. Yet something in Dean's manner nagged at her, the slight hesitation before his denial. Not the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly, the tension that had crept into his shoulders at the mention of Aaron's full name. "You're certain you never met him?" "Never heard the name before today." "Certain, ma'am." But his voice carried a note of strain that hadn't been there moments before, and his hands had stilled on the empty plate in a way that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. Nell studied his profile in the lamplight, noting the muscle that jumped along his jaw and the way his breathing had become slightly more controlled. Every instinct told her he was lying, but she couldn't fathom why. What reason would a stranger have to deny knowing Aaron? "Well," she said, finally retrieving the empty plate. "Thank you for the honest work today. The barn is dry and there's clean straw in the back stall." "Ma'am, I haven't done any work yet." Nell paused, confused. "I'm sorry. You thanked me for honest work, but I haven't earned that thanks yet. Come morning, you'll see what kind of worker I am. I don't take payment before I've delivered what I promise." The careful distinction impressed her, despite her lingering suspicions. In her experience, most men were quick to accept whatever they could get, regardless of what they had actually earned. Irene had been different, scrupulously honest about debts and obligations, but she had begun to think such integrity was rare. "Good night, then, Dean." "Good night, ma'am, and thank you again for the kindness." As Nell made her way back to the house, Emily's sleepy questions about the nice man in their barn, she found herself torn between hope and wariness. Something about Dean's presence felt like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared voice. But the mystery surrounding his reaction to Aaron's name left her unsettled. That night, she lay awake long after Emily's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of childhood sleep, listening to the desert sounds beyond their walls and wondering what the morning would bring. The next day dawned gray and bitter, with frost glittering like scattered diamonds on every surface, and a wind that cut through clothes as if they were made of tissue paper. Nell woke to unfamiliar sounds drifting through the thin walls, the protest of rusted hinges being worked free, the rhythmic bite of an axe meeting seasoned wood, the splash and gurgle of water being poured. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and stepped outside to find Dean already deep into what looked like a full day's work. The gate on the hog pen, which had been hanging crooked for weeks, now swung true and solid on hinges that moved without the grinding protest she had grown accustomed to. A neat pile of split firewood sat beside the kitchen door, each piece cut to the perfect size for her cooking stove. The water troughs that she struggled daily to fill from the distant pump were already brimming, and the animals had settled into contented feeding rather than the restless agitation that had become their norm. "Morning, ma'am," Dean said, pausing in his work to touch his forehead respectfully. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold air, and she could see he had been laboring since well before dawn. His horse, she noted, looked better already, still thin, but no longer bearing the desperate gauntness of the previous evening. Nell crossed her arms, unsure whether to feel grateful or annoyed at his presumption. "I didn't ask you to do all this." "No, ma'am, you didn't. But I see what needs doing, and idle hands serve no one." His tone was matter-of-fact without defensiveness or pride. A man pays his debts with work, not promises. Before she could formulate a response, Emily came barreling out the door, still in her nightgown, despite the morning chill, her ragdoll bouncing in her grip, like a fabric companion, eager to explore this new day. The sight of the child's breath forming small clouds in the cold air made Nell automatically reach for her. But Emily was already at the repaired gate, watching the hogs with obvious delight. "Mama, look, he fixed the piggy door. They're not trying to escape anymore. Emily, get back inside and get dressed properly." But even as she scolded, Nell couldn't help noticing how much calmer the animals seemed. For weeks, the broken gate had made feeding time a battle of wills between her and hogs that sensed weakness in their containment. Now they ate peacefully, no longer testing the boundaries of their pen. Animals know when things are set right. Dean observed his voice gentle as he spoke to Emily. "Makes them feel safe, like everything's in its proper place where it should be." Emily beamed at him with the open adoration that children reserved for adults who treated them with genuine respect rather than condescending tolerance. "Are you going to stay and help Mama with all the work?" Emily's stow. Heat flooded Nell's cheeks as mortification washed over her. "Inside, now, and get dressed before you catch your death." The child obeyed reluctantly, casting longing glances back at Dean as she trudged toward the house. But not before Nell caught the look that passed between them, a moment of connection that spoke of mutual understanding and affection already beginning to bloom. She followed Emily inside her mind, churning with conflicted emotions. In the span of a few hours before dawn, this stranger had accomplished more than she had managed in weeks of struggle. The implications were both humbling and somehow threatening to the careful independence she had been fighting to maintain. Over breakfast, Emily chattered about the nice man in their yard, with the enthusiasm of a child who had been too long without new experiences to capture her imagination. "He has kind eyes, Mama. Not scary like the men in town who look at us funny. And he made the piggies happy. She took a bite of cornbread and chewed thoughtfully. Papa would like him, wouldn't he? The innocent question hit Nell harder than any accusation could have. Would Aaron approve? Her husband had been practical above all else, understanding that survival on the frontier sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. But he had also been protective, suspicious of strangers, especially when those strangers were men who might pose a threat to his family's safety. Yet even as she tried to imagine Aaron's reaction, Nell found herself thinking of Dean's careful respect, his obvious skill with animals and tools, the way he had spoken to Emily, as if her questions and observations mattered. These were not the qualities of a man who meant harm. "Eat your breakfast, baby," she said instead of answering directly. "We'll see what kind of man he proves to be." When she carried a plate of beans and cornbread out to Dean at midday, she found him working on a section of fence where the winter winds had loosened several rails. His movements were economical and practiced those of someone who had spent years learning to work with wood and wire and the stubborn realities of frontier construction. He accepted the food with quiet thanks and settled on a stump to eat his manner unhurried, despite the work still waiting. Nell found herself lingering, settling on the porch step, with her own meal, studying this enigmatic stranger who had materialized at her door like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared voice. "You don't have to work so hard," she said finally. "I only promised food for whatever you could manage in a morning. Work gives a man purpose, ma'am. I've been without clear purpose for longer than I care to remember." His voice carried undertones of loss that resonated with her own grief. "Besides, this place deserves better than half measures. Your husband built something solid here." Again that slight tension when he mentioned Aaron, as if the words required careful consideration. Nell set down her fork and studied his weathered profile, noting the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Where do you come from, Dean? What brings you to this particular part of the territory?" He chewed thoughtfully before answering, his dark eyes focused on the distant mountains. "Long story, ma'am. Not sure it's one worth telling. I have time, and it seems only fair you know about my situation, about Aaron." For a moment she thought he might open up, might trust her with whatever secrets had driven him to her door. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. When he did respond, it was with the practiced evasion of someone who had fielded such questions before. "I've been traveling for near 2 years now, since I lost my family to sickness. Figured there wasn't much point in staying where everything reminded me of what was gone." The admission, offered quietly and without self-pity, hit Nell like a physical blow. "I'm sorry. That must have been... I can't imagine." "Can't you?" Dean's smile held no humor, only the tired acknowledgement of shared experience. "Seems to me you understand loss plenty well. Maybe better than most." The truth of his words settled between them, like a bridge neither had expected to find. Here was someone who truly understood the hollow ache of missing someone so profoundly that ordinary life felt like a performance put on for the benefit of others. "How do you bear it?" The question escaped before she could stop it raw with months of suppressed desperation. Dean was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilled on his empty plate. "One day at a time, I suppose. One task at a time. You find ways to make their loss mean something, to honor what they gave you by not giving up, even when giving up feels like the easier choice, especially then." His eyes found hers dark and steady. "Your little girl needs you to keep going. That's reason enough, isn't it?" The simple wisdom of his words brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. "Most days. But it's hard being responsible for everything, making all the decisions alone." "Doesn't have to be alone, though, does it? Community, neighbors, people willing to help, that's what makes frontier life bearable." "What community?" The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and she's got her own family to worry about. The men in town..." She trailed off, unwilling to voice the uncomfortable truth about the way some of them looked at her, now seeing opportunity in her vulnerability. Dean nodded as if her unfinished sentence had conveyed everything she couldn't say. Men who see a woman alone and think she's easy prey. Or easy pickings. Exactly. She was grateful he understood without requiring her to spell out the humiliating details of propositions disguised as offers of help, of men who assumed widowhood meant desperation. For what it's worth, ma'am, you strike me as someone who could handle herself just fine. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have people you can count on. The conversation was moving into territory that felt dangerous, loaded with implications neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. Nell found herself studying Dean's hands as he cleaned his plate, strong, scarred, capable hands that had already accomplished more in one morning than she managed in a week. You said you lost your family to sickness, she ventured. Were they your wife and child? Pain flickered across his features, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Wife and daughter. 2 winters passed. Fever swept through our village, took the young and strong first. How old was your daughter? 4. Just turned 4 the week before she got sick. His voice cracked slightly. Name was Chenoa, means dove in Apache. She was like your Emily. Curious about everything, always asking questions, always finding reasons to laugh. The parallel hung between them, unspoken but understood. Both had lost their original families, their first loves, their planned futures. Both were learning to navigate the particular loneliness of surviving when those dearest to them had not. She would have loved Emily. Dean continued, his voice steadier now. Would have taught her to braid grass into dolls to find the prettiest stones in the creek bed. Emily would have liked having a friend. She gets lonely out here with no other children to play with. Children need other children, but they also need adults who listen to them, who take their thoughts seriously. Dean's eyes found Emily through the kitchen window, where she was playing with her wooden animals. You do that well. She's lucky to have you. The compliment, offered without expectation of reciprocation, warmed her more than it should have. When had anyone last praised her? Mothering acknowledged the daily effort it took to protect Emily's childhood while managing the harsh realities of their situation. As the afternoon wore on, Nell found herself making excuses to work outside, ostensibly tending her small garden, but actually watching Dean repair fence rails and reinforce weak spots in their animal pens. His movements were economical and sure those of someone who had spent years learning to work efficiently and well. But more than his skill, she was struck by his attitude, the careful respect he showed for Aaron's construction, the way he strengthened rather than replaced what her husband had built. When Emily woke from her afternoon nap, she immediately sought out Dean, chattering at him with the fearless curiosity of childhood. He answered her questions with the same seriousness he had shown Nell, treating the child's observations as worthy of genuine consideration. Why do the piggies like to roll in mud? Emily asked, perched on the fence rail while Dean worked nearby. Keeps them cool when it's hot, and the mud protects their skin from bugs and sunburn. Dean explained patiently. They're smarter than most people think. Smarter than people. In some ways, yes. They know what they need to be comfortable, and they don't pretend to want things they can't have. Emily pondered this with the gravity of a philosopher. Like how I want Papa to come home, but he can't. The innocent question stopped Dean cold. Nell, who had been eavesdropping from the garden, saw his face go pale beneath its bronze coloring. For a long moment, he seemed unable to speak. Emily, Nell called, sensing the need to intervene. Come help me with the beans. But Emily wasn't finished with her line of inquiry. Mama says Papa got lost in the mountains. Do you think the mountains are too big for him to find his way home? Dean knelt to Emily's level, his large hands gentle as he steadied her on the fence rail. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Sometimes people get lost in ways that make it hard for them to find their way back, little dove. The endearment, the Apache word he had used for his own daughter, hit Nell like a physical blow. She saw the pain that flickered across Dean's features, the way his hands trembled slightly as he helped Emily down from the fence. But Mama keeps watching for him. Emily continued with the persistence of childhood. Every day she looks at the mountains like she's waiting. Your mama loves your papa very much, Dean said carefully. And sometimes loving someone means hoping for their return, even when... He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought in front of a child. But Nell heard what he hadn't said, saw it in the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes. Dean knew something about Aaron's fate, something he wasn't ready to share. That evening, after Emily had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed with her rag doll, and a story about brave princesses who lived in desert castles, Nell found Dean sitting on the porch, his back against the wall face, tilted up toward the star-scattered sky. She settled beside him on the weathered boards, leaving space between them, but close enough to catch the warmth of his presence in the cooling air. For a time, they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that sometimes companionship mattered more than conversation. "You know something about Aaron," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you?" Dean's hands stilled on the piece of wood he had been absently carving another toy for Emily, she realized. A small horse with carefully detailed mane and tail. "Nell, don't lie to me, please. I've been living with not knowing for months, and it's killing me. Whatever you know, whatever you think I can't handle, I need to hear it." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the lonely sound echoing off the canyon walls. Finally, Dean set aside his carving and turned to face her fully. "You're right, I do know something. But it's not easy to hear." Nell's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Tell me." Dean drew a shuddering breath, and when he spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something precious. "I was there the day he died." The simple statement hit her like a landslide, burying every hope she had carefully tended through the long months of uncertainty. The world tilted sideways, and she gripped the porch rail to keep from falling. "What?" 3 months ago up near Bear Ridge, where Lightning Creek cuts through the canyon. I was hunting when I heard someone calling for help. Nell's vision blurred as tears she had been holding back for months finally broke free. "You're lying." "I wish I was." Dean's voice carried the weight of terrible memory. "I found him at the bottom of a ravine, maybe 40 feet down. He'd been tracking an elk across wet rocks when the ledge gave way under his feet. And you left him there." The accusation burst from her lips like poison. "No." Dean's voice was steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I climbed down to him. Spent 2 days trying to get him out rigging ropes from my horse-building makeshift pulleys from deadfall timber, trying every way I could think of to bring him up. But you failed." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she were discussing the weather rather than her husband's death. His leg was broken in multiple places, probably some ribs too. Internal injuries I couldn't see but could tell were there from the way he breathed. Dean's voice cracked with remembered desperation. He was hurt too bad to move safely, and the canyon walls were too steep for one man with one horse to manage alone. The tears came harder now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Months of hope, of watching the horizon, of telling Emily that Papa would come home soon. All of it built on desperate self-deception. On the second night, when the cold was getting to him and he was getting weaker, he knew he wasn't going to make it out of that canyon alive. That's when he started talking about you and Emily. What did he say? The question came out as barely a whisper. Dean's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He said his wife was the strongest woman in Arizona territory, but that even strong women shouldn't have to face the world alone. Made me promise to find you to help however I could. Said you'd need someone dependable when winter came, someone who understood that family was worth protecting. Understanding crashed over her like a second wave of grief. That's why you came here. Not by chance, but because he sent you. He described this place in detail, told me your name said I'd know the homestead by the cottonwoods and the crooked gate on the hog pen. Dean's voice broke completely. He made me swear on my daughter's grave that I'd take care of his family, that I wouldn't let you face the hard times alone. Nell buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Aaron was really gone, no hope of return, no miracle rescue, no happy ending to sustain her through the dark nights. But his final act had been to ensure their survival, to send them help in the form of this grieving stranger. Why didn't you tell me immediately? She managed through her tears. Why let me hope he might still be alive? Because I failed him. The anguish in Dean's voice was raw and terrible. Because I let a good man die when I should have found a way to save him. I wandered for weeks before I could face coming here, knowing I'd have to look his wife and child in the eye and confess that I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to keep my word to him. Where is he now, his body? I buried him on a hill overlooking the valley where it happened. Built a proper cairn to mark the spot, said what prayers I knew. Dean's voice grew softer. He told me you'd like the view wildflowers in spring aspens, that turn gold in autumn, a creek that runs clear and cold year-round. The image broke something inside her that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will. Aaron had always loved high places, had climbed to the roof of their house just to watch sunsets paint the desert in brilliant colors. Of course, he would want to rest somewhere with a view. Through her grief, she became aware of Dean shifting beside her, moving closer, but not touching, respecting her need to mourn, while offering the comfort of his presence. When she finally looked up, his weathered face was etched with pain that clearly matched her own. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "God, Nell, I'm so sorry I couldn't save him. I've replayed those 2 days 1,000 times trying to figure out what I could have done differently." She studied his features in the starlight, seeing now what she had missed before, the guilt that had driven him to her door, the weight of obligation that had kept him working without rest or complaint. He hadn't stayed because he wanted to, but because he had made a promise to a dying man, and his own honor wouldn't let him break it. But as she watched him struggle with his perceived failure, Nell realized something that surprised her with its clarity. "Aaron chose well," she said quietly. Dean's head snapped up, surprise replacing the pain in his dark eyes. "Ma'am, he chose well when he picked you to send to us." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice growing stronger. "You could have ridden away after he died. Could have decided his promise wasn't binding, that you didn't owe anything to strangers. But you didn't. I gave my word. To a man who was dying, who had no way to hold you to that promise. You came here and kept faith with someone who couldn't reward you for it, couldn't punish you for failing. That says something about the kind of man you are." Dean's throat worked silently, as if her words had caught him unprepared for forgiveness rather than blame. "He trusted you with the most precious things in his world," Nell continued. "His wife, his daughter, his home. That wasn't an accident, Dean. Even dying, even desperate Aaron was a good judge of character. He saw something in you that made him believe you'd keep faith. I failed to save him. You tried. You stayed with him so he didn't die alone. You listened to his final words and took them seriously enough to change the course of your own life." She reached out tentatively and covered his scarred hand with her smaller one. "That's not failure. That's honor." They sat in silence as her words settled between them, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer stood alone. Beside it now was gratitude for Dean's presence, for Aaron's final gift to his family, for the strange mercy that had brought them together in their mutual loss. "Show me," Nell said suddenly. When the weather permits, I want to see where you buried him. Dean nodded slowly. If that's what you need. It is. She took a shuddering breath, feeling as if she had been holding it for 3 months. And Dean, thank you. For staying with him, for coming here, for keeping your promise. Aaron couldn't have chosen better. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of storms ahead. But inside their small circle of lamplight, warmed by shared grief and the beginning of mutual understanding, 2 wounded souls sat in comfortable silence, no longer quite so alone in their sorrow. As the days flowed into one another like water finding its course, Dean became woven into the fabric of their daily existence, with a naturalness that surprised them all. He rose before dawn to tend the animals and bank the fires, spent his daylight hours strengthening what was weak and repairing what was broken, and occupied his evenings carving toys for Emily or helping Nell with tasks that required more strength than her slender frame could provide. The little girl worshipped him with the uncomplicated devotion of childhood, following him through his daily rounds like a small shadow eager to learn everything about the adult world. Her questions were endless and wide-ranging, from practical inquiries about why chickens couldn't fly very well to philosophical wonderings about whether stars got lonely being so far apart. Dean answered every question with patient thoroughness, treating her curiosity as something precious rather than annoying. When she wondered aloud why birds flew south in winter, he explained about food sources and temperature in terms she could understand. When she asked about the patterns of stars, he taught her Apache names for constellations, weaving stories that made her eyes grow wide with wonder. Nell watched these interactions from her kitchen window or the porch, her emotions a complex tangle of gratitude, loss, and something that might have been envy. Aaron had loved Emily deeply, but he had been too focused on the constant struggle of building their homestead to spend time on such simple pleasures. He had seen her questions as interruptions to serious work, her laughter as a distraction from the business of survival. Dean treated her curiosity as if it were the most important thing in the world, giving her his complete attention, whether she was asking about the habits of desert animals or showing him a flower she had picked. The difference in approach was striking, and Nell found herself wondering what kind of father Aaron might have become if he had lived long enough to relax into the role. The mystery of Dean himself continued to unfold in small revelations. He knew the desert with the intimate familiarity of someone who had been born to it, could predict weather changes by reading cloud formations and animal behavior with uncanny accuracy. His hands bore the scars of old wounds, some clearly from accidents with tools or thorns, others that looked suspiciously like knife or bullet marks from less peaceful encounters. Sometimes she caught him staring toward the mountains with an expression of profound sadness that went beyond simple grief. There were layers to his loss. She realized complexities he hadn't shared, even when confessing Aaron's death. But she had learned not to push some wounds needed to heal in their own time, and forcing confidences rarely led to lasting trust. One evening, as they sat on the porch listening to Emily practice with the wooden flute Dean had carved for her, Nell found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. The premature gray in his black hair, the deep lines around his eyes, the way his hands never seemed to be completely still, all spoke of a life that had contained more than its share of hardship. "How long were you married?" she asked softly, not wanting to wake Emily, who had fallen asleep in her chair with the flute still clutched in her small hands. Dean's carving knife paused in its work. 8 years. We were young when we wed. I was barely 20. She was 18. Thought we had all the time in the world to figure things out. What was she like? His smile was sad, but genuine. Ayana. It means eternal blossom in our tongue. She had a laugh that could make flowers bloom out of season, could find something to be grateful for even in the hardest times. He resumed his carving, shaping what looked like a small deer. She would have loved you, I think. Would have appreciated your strength, your determination to protect your child no matter what. And your daughter, Chanoa. Dove. She was... Dean's voice caught slightly. She was fearless in the way only children can be. Would chase rabbits twice her size, climb trees that made grown men nervous, ask questions that made you realize how much you didn't know about the world. The parallel to Emily was obvious and painful, like our little one with her endless curiosity. Exactly like that. Sometimes when Emily asks her questions, I can almost hear Chenoa's voice. It's both comforting and heartbreaking. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Emily sleep in the gentle glow of the lantern light. The child's face was peaceful, innocent of the adult sorrows that surrounded her, and Nell felt a fierce surge of protectiveness that almost took her breath away. "Do you think about them every day?" she asked. "Every day, every night. Sometimes I wake up expecting to find them there, and the remembering hits all over again." Dean set aside his carving and leaned back against the porch wall. "Does it get easier, the missing?" Nell considered the question carefully. "Different, maybe. Less sharp, but deeper somehow. Like a scar that doesn't hurt to touch anymore, but never really disappears." "That's exactly right." Dean's voice held surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to understand so precisely. "People kept telling me the pain would fade, that time would heal everything. But it's not healing exactly. It's learning to carry the weight without falling down. Learning to honor what they gave us without being crushed by what they took with them when they left." Dean turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You understand. Most people don't, not really. They want grief to follow a schedule to wrap up neatly after a decent interval. How long is decent? How long before people start hinting that it's time to move on or get back to living?" Nell's voice carried a thread of bitterness she hadn't intended to reveal. "Too soon, whatever they think it should be." Dean's laugh held no humor. As if loving someone deeply was a condition to be cured rather than a gift to be treasured. The understanding that passed between them in that moment was profound and mutual. The recognition of kindred souls who had loved completely and lost devastatingly. It was a bond forged in shared experience that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't walked the same dark path. "Dean," Nell said carefully, "when you made that promise to Aaron, did you think about how it would change your life? How it would tie you to strangers, to responsibilities that weren't originally yours?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his words came slowly, as if he were discovering their truth even as he voiced them. "At first it felt like another burden to carry. Another way I'd failed, couldn't save my own family, couldn't save Aaron. But maybe I could at least keep faith with his final wishes." He picked up the small wooden deer he'd been carving, turning it over in his scarred hands. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about obligation and became about choice. "What kind of choice?" "The choice to be part of something again. To matter to people who mattered to me." He glanced toward the kitchen window, where Emily's artwork drawings of flowers and animals decorated the glass. "Your daughter has never known me as anything but the man who fixes things and tells stories. She doesn't see failure when she looks at me. She just sees someone who cares about her welfare." "And what do you see when you look at us?" Dean's eyes found hers steady and serious. "I see what Aaron saw. A family worth protecting, worth working for, worth building a life around. But more than that." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I see the possibility of healing. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but maybe finding ways to be whole again, despite the broken places." The words hung between them, heavy with implication and hope. Nell felt her heart racing, recognizing the moment as a turning point that could change everything or destroy the fragile peace they had built. "Healing," she repeated softly. "That's a frightening word for someone who's gotten used to the safety of numbness." "Is that what it's been, safe?" Nell considered the question honestly. "Easier, maybe. When you stop hoping for things to change, you can't be disappointed when they don't. But you can't be surprised by joy either. The simple truth of his observation hit her like revelation. When had she last felt genuine joy, rather than mere absence of pain? When had she allowed herself to want something more than simple survival? Joy feels like betrayal sometimes, she admitted. Like being happy means forgetting them, dishonoring their memory. Or maybe, Dean said gently, being happy is the best way to honor what they gave us. Maybe they'd want us to find reasons to smile again, to discover that life still holds possibilities worth exploring. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about pretty horses and morning sunshine. The innocent contentment in her voice was like a benediction blessing their adult conversation with a reminder of why healing mattered. She's been happier these past weeks than I've seen her since Aaron disappeared, Nell observed. More herself curious and laughing and secure. Children are resilient when they feel safe. She knows you love her, and now she has someone else who cares about her welfare. That's what family is supposed to provide, multiple sources of security and affection. Is that what we are, a family? The question escaped before Nell could censor it, and she immediately felt heat flood her cheeks. But Dean didn't seem startled by her boldness. Instead, he smiled with gentle understanding. We could be, if that's something you'd want, if you think Aaron would approve. I think Aaron would want Emily to have a father figure who listens to her questions and makes her laugh. I think he'd want me to have a partner who shares the work and the worries. She took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. And I think he'd want both of us to have someone who understands about loving people we've lost, without that love preventing us from loving people who are still here. Dean reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused honest with work and solid with presence. Then we'll take it slowly, he said. Let it grow naturally without forcing anything or making promises we're not ready to keep. We'll see what develops between us while we figure out how to be a family. Nell squeezed his fingers, feeling for the first time in months that the future held possibilities beyond mere endurance. I'd like that. As if summoned by their words, a shooting star streaked across the desert sky, burning bright against the darkness before vanishing into memory. Emily would have loved it, would have made a wish, and demanded to know where stars went when they fell. She would have made a wish, Nell said softly. What would you wish for? Dean asked. Nell looked at their joined hands, at Emily sleeping peacefully in her chair, at the man who had appeared at their door like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared voice. Nothing, she said, and meant it. For the first time in months, I have everything I need, right here. The first hard freeze came in early November, coating the desert in crystalline beauty that took Emily's breath away with delight. She ran outside despite the bitter air, her nightgown flying around her ankles, as she marveled at the transformation of their familiar world into something magical and strange. Look, Mama, the water turned hard. She called, poking experimentally at the ice that had formed over her water bucket. It's called frost, sweetheart, Nell corrected gently, but she was smiling at her daughter's wonder. When it gets cold enough, water turns solid. Dean emerged from the barn, carrying an armload of hay, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. First real cold snap of the season, he observed, setting down his burden to help Emily examine the frost patterns on the pump handle. Winter's coming early this year. The weeks leading up to this moment had been a time of careful preparation and growing intimacy. Dean had spent days cutting and stacking firewood, banking the house foundation with earth and straw, checking every joint and seam for gaps that might let in the killing cold. But more than the physical preparations, they had all been preparing emotionally for the enforced closeness that winter would bring. Living in close quarters during the harsh months ahead would test the fragile bonds they had been building. There would be nowhere to retreat when tensions arose, no outside work to provide escape from domestic conflicts. If they were to survive as a family unit, they would need to learn new rhythms of coexistence. Will you tell me about winter in the Apache way? Emily asked Dean as they watched their breath make clouds in the morning air. Winter is the time of stories, Dean said, settling on his heels to meet her at eye level. When the world grows quiet and families gather close, that's when the old tales get told, when children learn about their people and their place in the great circle of life. What kind of stories? Stories about changing woman who brings the seasons. Stories about Coyote, who is sometimes wise and sometimes foolish, but always curious like little girls I know. His eyes twinkled with gentle humor. Stories about brave warriors and clever women, and the spirits that live in the mountains and streams. Emily's eyes grew wide with anticipation. Will you tell me those stories? If your mother doesn't mind sharing our winter evenings with Apache tales. Nell, who had been listening from the doorway, felt her heart contract with something that might have been joy. I think that sounds wonderful. Emily should know about all her heritage, the world her father came from, and the one you're bringing to us. The casual reference to her heritage and the world you're bringing marked another small step in their evolution from strangers to family. These gradual acknowledgments of their growing connection felt more significant than grand declarations might have. That evening, as the wind howled around their small house and rattled the shutters with icy fingers, they settled into their first winter evening as a complete family unit. Emily curled between Nell and Dean on the small sofa Erin had built her ragdoll clutched tight as she listened to Dean's deep voice weave stories of the desert people. Long ago, before there were houses or fences or boundaries drawn on paper, changing woman walked across this land with the seasons in her hands. Nell found herself as enchanted as Emily by the rich imagery of Dean's storytelling. His voice painted pictures of a world where animals spoke with human voices, where the mountains themselves were alive with ancient wisdom, where courage and kindness were rewarded, and selfishness brought its own punishment. But more than the stories themselves, she was moved by the way Dean told them, with reverence for their origins, with careful attention to their moral lessons, with the understanding that these tales carried the accumulated wisdom of generations. This was heritage being passed down, culture being preserved and shared. When Emily finally succumbed to sleep, her head heavy against Dean's shoulder, Nell felt a profound sense of rightness about their domestic scene. This was what family should look like. Adults sharing the responsibility of nurturing a child's growth. Multiple sources of wisdom and comfort available when needed. Thank you, she said softly, as Dean carefully transferred Emily to her bed. For sharing your stories, your heritage. She needs to understand that the world is bigger and more mysterious than what she can see from our porch. Every child deserves to know that they're part of something larger than themselves. Dean replied, tucking the quilts around Emily's small form. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're lessons about how to live well, how to treat others, how to find your place in the world. As they settled by the fire for their own adult conversation, Nell found herself studying Dean's profile in the flickering light. The domestic scene, tucking Emily into bed, banking the fire, preparing for sleep, felt both natural and revolutionary. For months, she had handled every evening routine alone, carrying all the responsibility for decisions large and small. It feels strange, she admitted, having someone else here for the bedtime rituals. Good strange, but different. Different how? Like I don't have to carry everything by myself anymore. Like Emily has two people watching out for her instead of just one person trying to be enough. She smiled ruefully. I didn't realize how heavy that burden was until I started sharing it. Dean poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Aaron carried his share of that weight too, didn't he? Before, he did. But differently than you do. Nell chose her words carefully, not wanting to criticize Aaron's memory, but needing to acknowledge the truth of her experience. Aaron was focused on building, on providing, on making sure we had what we needed to survive. But he didn't He wasn't naturally comfortable with the daily intimacy of family life. What do you mean? He loved us deeply and completely. But he showed it through work more than words, through providing rather than playing. Emily's questions made him impatient. Sometimes he saw them as interruptions to serious business rather than opportunities for connection. Dean nodded thoughtfully. Some men are like that. They express love through action rather than attention, through protection rather than presence. Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with that. We needed his protection, his hard work. But Emily She needs someone who delights in her curiosity rather than tolerating it. And what do you need? The question, asked quietly and without presumption, made Nell's breath catch. When had anyone last asked what she needed rather than what she could provide? I need... She paused, surprising herself with the difficulty of articulating desires she had buried for so long. I need partnership, conversation. Someone who sees me as more than just Emily's mother or Aaron's widow. What else are you besides those things? The question was like permission to remember aspects of herself that had been dormant for months. I'm someone who loves to read when I can find books and time. Someone who notices the way light changes throughout the day, who finds beauty in small things. Someone who has opinions about politics and religion, and whether it's better to plant beans in rows or scattered. She laughed softly. Someone who used to dream about traveling to San Francisco, seeing the ocean, visiting places where people gathered to discuss ideas rather than just survival. Those dreams don't have to stay buried, don't they? How does a woman with a child and a homestead in the middle of nowhere pursue dreams about cities and oceans? Maybe not right away, Dean conceded. But children grow up, homesteads can be sold or managed by others. Dreams deferred aren't necessarily dreams abandoned. The possibility he was offering that her life might contain chapters beyond simple survival felt both thrilling and terrifying. For months, she had focused so narrowly on getting through each day that the concept of long-term planning had become foreign. What about your dreams? She asked. What did you want before my world ended? Dean's smile was sad, but not bitter. I wanted to be a good husband and father. I wanted to learn enough of the white man's ways to help my people navigate the changes coming to our lands. I thought maybe I could serve as a bridge between worlds, help both sides understand each other better. That's still possible, isn't it? Maybe. In a different form than I originally imagined. He looked at her meaningfully. Maybe by raising a child who understands both Apache wisdom and settler determination. Maybe by showing neighbors that cooperation is possible, that differences don't have to mean conflict. The implications of his words, the assumption that they would be raising Emily together, that their union could serve larger purposes, sent warmth spreading through her chest. This was what partnership could look like. Shared dreams that were larger than individual desires, mutual support in pursuit of goals that mattered. I'd like that, she said simply. Building something together that honors both our backgrounds, both our losses, both our hopes. Outside, the wind intensified, driving snow against their windows with increasing force. But inside their small sanctuary, warmed by fire and growing affection, the future suddenly seemed full of possibilities. Neither had dared imagine alone. As December deepened and the snows piled higher around their small house, the three of them fell into rhythms of winter domesticity that felt both new and ancient. Dean told stories every evening, his deep voice weaving tales that transported them from their lamplit parlor to worlds of magic and meaning. Emily absorbed these stories like desert earth, absorbing rare rain, storing them up to be shared with the wooden animals Dean continued to carve for her entertainment. During the long days when blizzards kept them housebound, they discovered the challenges and rewards of close-quarters living. Emily, accustomed to having the run of the outdoors, sometimes grew restless and fractious. Dean proved remarkably patient with her moods, redirecting her energy into learning projects, teaching her to braid rope from scraps of fabric, showing her how to whittle simple shapes from soft wood, engaging her in games that exercised both her mind and body in the confined space. Nell found herself marveling at his instinctive understanding of childhood needs. Where Aaron had seen Emily's restlessness as misbehavior to be corrected, Dean recognized it as natural energy seeking appropriate outlets. His responses were creative rather than punitive, engaging rather than dismissive. But it was the growing intimacy between herself and Dean that surprised her most. Not physical intimacy, they were both too careful, too respectful of propriety, and Emily's presence for anything beyond the occasional brush of hands or meaningful glance. Rather, it was the deepening emotional connection and the daily discoveries of compatibility and mutual understanding. They found they shared similar views on child-rearing, both believing in treating Emily with respect while maintaining appropriate boundaries. They discovered mutual appreciation for books. Dean had somehow acquired a surprising education, despite his Apache upbringing, and their evening conversations ranged over topics from philosophy to practical politics. Most importantly, they learned to navigate disagreements with patience and good humor. When Dean suggested changes to the way certain chores were organized, Nell initially bristled with defensive pride. But his explanations were logical and his manner respectful, making it clear that he was offering suggestions rather than commands. When Nell corrected his approach to some domestic task, he listened without taking offense, understanding that her methods had been developed through hard-won experience. "We're learning to be partners," Nell observed one evening as they worked together preparing the next day's bread. "Not just sharing the same space, but actually collaborating. It's harder than I expected." Dean admitted needing dough with the same careful attention he brought to all tasks. "I'd grown used to making decisions alone, accounting to no one but myself for my choices. And I'd grown used to carrying all the responsibility myself, never having to explain my reasoning or consider anyone else's preferences." Nell shaped loaves with practiced efficiency. "But this is better, isn't it? Having someone to share the thinking as well as the work. Much better. Even when we disagree, even when it takes longer to reach decisions, it's better to know I'm not alone with everything." Their conversation was interrupted by Emily's appearance in the kitchen, trailing her blanket and looking drowsy from her afternoon nap. "Are you making bread for tomorrow?" she asked, automatically moving to Dean's side, where she knew she would be welcomed into whatever activity was underway. "We are," Dean confirmed, lifting her onto a chair where she could watch more easily. "Would you like to help shape the last loaf?" Emily's face lit up with the pure joy of being included in adult work. Under Dean's patient guidance, she worked a portion of dough into something that vaguely resembled a loaf shape, her small hands mimicking his movements with serious concentration. Watching them work together, Nell felt her heart contract, with an emotion too complex for simple naming. This was what she had dreamed of during her pregnancy, a family scene of cooperation and inclusion. A child learning life skills from adults who delighted in teaching her. Aaron had loved Emily, but he had never shown this easy comfort with involving her in daily tasks. "There," Dean said when Emily's contribution was complete. "That will be your special loaf just for you. Will it taste different because I made it? It will taste like love," Dean said seriously. "When you put care into making something, it always tastes better." Emily pondered this with the gravity she brought to all of Dean's pronouncements. "Then your bread always tastes like love, because you always put care into everything." The innocent observation hit both adults with unexpected force. From the mouths of babes came truths that adults often struggle to recognize or articulate. "Yes," Nell said softly, meeting Dean's eyes over Emily's head. "He does always put care into everything." That evening, after Emily had been tucked into bed with promises of fresh bread for breakfast, Nell and Dean sat by the fire in comfortable silence. The storm outside had intensified, rattling the windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney, but their small sanctuary felt secure and warm. "She's right, you know," Nell said eventually, "about the care you put into everything. I've been watching you for months now, and I've never seen you approach any task carelessly or half-heartedly." Dean looked up from the leather harness he was mending, surprise in his dark eyes. "It's just the way I was raised. My father used to say that anything worth doing was worth doing well, that sloppy work dishonored both the worker and the work. It's more than that, though. You don't just do things well, you do them with attention to their meaning and their connection to the people who will be affected by them." Nell set aside her sewing and turned to face him fully. "When you repair something of Aaron's, you study how he built it first. You strengthen his design rather than replacing it with your own. When you make toys for Emily, you think about what will delight her specifically, not just what might amuse any child. Those things matter. Yes, they do. But not everyone recognizes that they matter or cares enough to act on that recognition." She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "I think that's what Aaron saw in you, what made him trust you with his final request. He recognized someone who would care about us, not just as an obligation, but as people who deserved attention and consideration." Dean set aside his work and leaned forward, his expression serious. "Nell, there's something I need to tell you. Something about that day, about Aaron's death." Her heart began to race, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. "What is it?" "When I found him in that canyon, when I was trying to figure out how to get him out, we talked for hours. About you, about Emily, about his hopes and fears for your future." Dean's voice grew thick with memory. "But we also talked about me, about my losses, about why I was wandering alone through country that wasn't familiar to me." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. About Ayanna and Chenoa, about how their deaths had left me feeling purposeless, like I was just marking time until I could join them." Dean's hands clenched and unclenched as he spoke. "Aaron said something that stayed with me ever since. He said that maybe I'd been led to that place to him for a reason, that maybe his need and my emptiness were two halves of the same solution." Nell felt tears prick her eyes as understanding dawned. "He didn't just send you to us out of desperation. He thought we could help each other. He said you and Emily could give me reason to live again, and I could give you the protection and partnership you'd need to thrive rather than just survive." Dean's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said love wasn't a finite resource, that learning to love again didn't diminish what we'd felt for those we'd lost." The words hung between them, loaded with implication and invitation. Nell felt her breath catch as she recognized the moment as a threshold, a place where they could step forward into acknowledged affection or retreat into the safety of undefined companionship. "Do you think he was right?" she asked softly. Dean's eyes found hers across the small space, dark and steady, and full of tentative hope. "I think I've fallen in love with both of you, and that loving you feels like healing rather than betrayal. I think Aaron was wiser than either of us realized." The confession hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Nell felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she contemplated the magnitude of what he was offering, what he was asking for in return. "I love you too." She whispered the words, emerging with surprising ease. "Both as the man who kept faith with my husband, and as the person who's become essential to my happiness, to Emily's well-being, to our future." Dean's face transformed with relief and joy, the guarded expression he habitually wore melting away to reveal the full depth of his feelings. But he made no move to close the physical distance between them, understanding that emotional acknowledgement didn't automatically translate into physical intimacy. "What happens now?" he asked. Nell considered the question carefully, thinking of Emily asleep in the next room, of the promises she had made to Aaron, of the careful balance they had built between propriety and affection. "Now we continue as we have been," she said finally. learning to be a family growing into love at our own pace, letting Emily adjust to the changes in her own time. When spring comes, when the preacher makes his circuit through the territory again, we can talk about making things official. And until then, we have what we have. Affection acknowledged, partnership deepened, hope for the future shared between us. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. Is that enough for now? Dean's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. It's everything. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside their small sanctuary, two hearts that had been separately broken began the delicate process of healing together. Love, they discovered, was indeed not a finite resource. It was possible to honor the past while embracing the future, to remember those who were gone while cherishing those who remained. As winter deepened around them, their small family continued to grow stronger, bound together by shared work, mutual affection, and the gradual understanding that sometimes the most profound blessings came disguised as loss, that sometimes the greatest gifts arrived at the darkest moments, that sometimes love found a way to bloom even in the harshest seasons. When spring finally arrived, painting the desert in impossible shades of green and gold, they would be ready for the new chapter it would bring. But for now, in the depths of winter's embrace, they were content to tend the warmth they had created together, to nurture the love that had grown from grief, to believe in the possibility of happiness even after devastating loss. The circuit preacher arrived on a morning in late March when the desert was exploding with wildflowers and the air hummed with the promise of renewal. Nell heard his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth long before she saw him cresting the ridge, and her heart began to race with anticipation and nervous excitement. "Emily, come inside and put on your good dress," she called to her daughter, who was playing with her wooden animals in the shade of the cottonwoods. "Why, Mama, are we going somewhere?" "No, sweetheart. Someone special is coming to visit us." Dean emerged from the barn where he had been checking on a mare that was due to foal any day. His eyes found Nell's across the yard, and she saw her own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in his gaze. They had spent the winter months growing deeper in love and commitment. But they had also maintained careful propriety for Emily's sake and their own peace of mind. Dean continued to sleep in the barn, continued to observe the boundaries that unmarried couples were expected to maintain. But their emotional intimacy had deepened daily, and they both longed for the social and spiritual recognition that marriage would bring. The preacher, a weathered man named Samuel Mitchell, who had been serving the scattered communities of the territory for over a decade, greeted them with warm familiarity. He had known Aaron had in fact performed the wedding ceremony that had joined Nell to her first husband 4 years earlier. "I'm a Mrs. Turner," he said, dismounting stiffly from his horse. "It's good to see you looking well. And this must be little Emily. My, how she's grown." Emily, dressed in her best blue dress, with her hair carefully braided, curtsied politely as Nell had taught her. "Hello, Preacher Mitchell. Mama says you're going to make Dean officially my papa." The child's innocent directness brought smiles to all the adult faces. Over the long winter months, Emily had naturally begun referring to Dean as her papa, understanding, instinctively, that he had taken on that role in their family even without official recognition. "Well now," Preacher Mitchell said, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor, "that's a mighty important job, being officially someone's papa. Are you sure you're ready for such responsibility, Dean?" Dean's answer was immediate and heartfelt. "More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life, sir." The simple ceremony took place under the cottonwoods by the creek, with Emily serving as their only witness, besides the preacher himself. Nell wore her best dress, the green one Aaron had bought for her second wedding anniversary, and carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers that Dean and Emily had gathered that morning. But around her neck, on a fine silver chain, she wore Aaron's wedding ring, not as a symbol of divided loyalty, but as an acknowledgement that love was not a finite resource, that honoring the past was compatible with embracing the future. Dean had carved their wedding rings from mesquite wood during the long winter evenings, laying them with small pieces of turquoise he had carried from his homeland. They were simple but beautiful symbols of their commitment to building something new together, while respecting the traditions that had shaped them both. Do you, Dean Crowfeather, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Dean's voice was steady and sure. I do, with all my heart and soul. Worm, and do you, Nell Turner, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Nell looked into Dean's dark eyes, seeing there the reflection of her own joy and the promise of shared tomorrows. Around Aaron's ring, her throat tightened with emotion, but it was gratitude rather than grief that filled her heart. I do, she said clearly, with all my heart and soul. When Preacher Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Emily cheered and threw handfuls of flower petals into the desert breeze. They settled around the small family like blessings, bright against the red earth and endless sky. The kiss Dean and Nell shared was gentle, reverent, full of promise. For the intimacy they would finally be free to explore. But it was Emily's delighted laughter that made the moment complete, her pure joy in seeing the adults she loved make their commitment official and permanent. That evening, as they shared their wedding supper around the familiar kitchen table, Nell felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of one story, but the beginning of another one that honored the past while embracing the future, that welcomed new love without dismissing old loyalties. Are you happy, Mama? Emily asked as Dean tucked her into bed with extra ceremony befitting such a special day. I'm very happy, sweetheart. Are you? The happiest I've ever been, Emily declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Now we're a real family, aren't we? With a mama and a papa and everything? We've been a real family for months, Dean said gently. Today just made it official for the whole world to see. That's good, Emily said, snuggling deeper into her quilts. I like having the whole world know that you're my papa. Later, as the newlyweds sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, they spoke quietly of the future they would build together. Their plans were modest but heartfelt, to expand the farm gradually, to give Emily brothers and sisters if God blessed them, so to serve as a bridge between the Apache and settler communities that had too often viewed each other with suspicion. Do you think Aaron would approve? Nell asked, voicing the question that had lingered in both their minds throughout the day. Dean was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I think Aaron wanted you to be happy, wanted Emily to be loved and protected, wanted his legacy to be something more than just tragedy and loss. I think he'd be pleased to see how well his final gift turned out. His final gift, sending me to you, trusting me with the most precious things in his world, believing that love could grow from loss, that families could be rebuilt from broken pieces. Dean pressed a kiss to the top of her head. He gave us each other, Nell. That may be the greatest gift anyone ever gave. As if summoned by their words, a shooting star streaked across the desert sky, burning bright against the darkness before vanishing into memory. They made wishes on its light for continued happiness for children to come, for the strength to build something lasting and good from the foundation of their shared losses. Years later, when Emily was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how love came knocking at their door in the form of a tired stranger who kept a dying man's promise. How sometimes the best families weren't born, but chosen, built from the ruins of loss and the determination to begin again. She would tell them about Aaron Turner, the father she barely remembered, but whose love had been wise enough to send them Dean. About her mother's courage in learning to love again after devastating loss. About Dean's honor in keeping faith with a stranger's final request and discovering his own capacity for healing in the process. But most of all, she would tell them about the power of love to transform even the deepest grief into hope. The way that opening your heart to new possibilities didn't diminish the memory of those you'd lost, but instead honored the love they had given you by allowing it to grow and multiply and bless new lives. And on quiet evenings when the desert wind sang through the cottonwoods and the stars showed bright and eternal overhead, they would remember that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as disasters, that sometimes the most profound blessings emerged from the darkest sorrows, and that love, true love, was indeed not a finite resource, but an inexhaustible wellspring that could heal any wound and bridge any distance.